Developing Scalable Apps, developed with Google, is your guide to the most efficient way to build scalable applications on Google App Engine. Learn how to architect and build highly scalable, reliable apps by leveraging Google Cloud Platform. This class covers concepts like platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, data storage, caching, cloud endpoints, and more to help you develop a highly scalable backend that works seamlessly with both web and native mobile apps. For more information, visit udacity.com/Google.
Hey everybody, this is Wesley Chen from Google, and here with me are the instructors for the Developing Scalable Apps with Google App Engine course.
Glad to be here, Wes.
Awesome. Today we're going to talk about why making your app scale is important, as well as 2 key tools that will help you become a scalable developer. We'll also tell you why our Scalable Apps course is the best resource out there for you to learn, and we'll take a bunch of student questions about scalable development. We'll also tell you how you can get $500 worth of cloud credit, as well as 50% off of the cloud qualification exam, so stay tuned to the end of the show for that information. Are you ready? Let's kick it off with the first question. Why should you learn to build scalable apps?
Well, cloud computing is a growing field, but actually that's not why you should build scalable apps. You should build, when you build your app, you want it to be able to scale to handle the number of users you get, whether it's just a few or whether it's millions. So you need to construct your app to use the right resources, to generate new resources as they're needed, but only as they're needed. So you don't end up paying for resources that you don't use.
Great.
And hopefully your app will go viral and you will get millions of users.
All right, thanks for the scalable part, but what is Google App Engine and why should you care about it?
So Google App Engine, I think it's a marvelous technology. I've been working with server-side applications for almost 15 years now. So Google App Engine abstracts all the complexities around creating massively scalable server systems. So prior to Google App Engine, you were left with a virtual machine and you had to do all the software installs, you had to do the high availability aspects of constructing your server, all the load balancing across multiple servers in case you needed to scale. Well, App Engine takes all that away, and that's we explained that in the first lesson of the course. So that really means that you can focus on your core application logic, and you don't have to deal with all of those infrastructure problems that you're exposed to if you're using a classical virtual machine approach.
Okay, great. Awesome. So that's the main technology that the course is focused on, but there's another technology called Google Cloud Endpoints. What's that?
So Google Cloud Endpoints is a service that's provided in App Engine that allows you to define your API and basically make it available beyond the app so that other apps, mobile apps, other web apps can call the API inside your App Engine, app. And you define your app, you define your API, and you give it a little annotation that declares that it's an endpoint. And then it's available so other apps can use it. It really makes it easy to surface your API beyond your application.
Great. I recently checked out the docs for this course. It sounds pretty interesting, but why do I need a course? Why this course?
So first of all, I think Udacity is doing a great job in combining different medias, the tablet and the live videos, as well as the exercises. So it keeps you engaged throughout all of the different lessons, hopefully, if we did a good job, right? Then you get to create your own project. So at the end of the course, you will actually have a real App Engine project that you've essentially created from scratch. It's actually teaching you all of the steps involved to create a real App Engine project. And then we combine it with a lot of environments at Google. And so you'll see a little bit of Googliness and you'll see a little bit of Googleplex as part of the course as well. So we hopefully that will engage the students.
All right, great. That sounds really exciting. Let's get to some student questions, shall we? First one is, do you have any resources, books, or articles, or some kind of advice on how to design a good and reliable API for your service?
All right, yeah, that's a very general question. I'd say to a large extent it's about trial and error, of course. There's rarely an API that doesn't change over time, so to say. I think from a personal experience, the most important thing to get control over when you design your API is where you have session-oriented logic, meaning that a single request to the server is not completely fulfilled. You're actually carrying state across multiple different calls to the APIs of the server. That's something that can really complicate an API. I would go and I'd check. In the course we look at API Explorer. I'd use that to check out some Google APIs. For example, the Calendar API is an excellent one to check out with the API Explorer. And then, of course, once you start to use cloud endpoints and you get your API into the API Explorer, also use the API Explorer to try out different combinations of calls and arguments to see that you're okay with the API from another perspective than just the client programmatic interface.
Right. So I guess I can simulate my API as something that Google's written too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the API we create in the course using Cloud Endpoint, that becomes like a Google API. It becomes available from the same tools, the API Explorer, as any other Google API.
Wow, that sounds really, really useful. All right.
So there was one other part of that question, which was resources, books, and so on. And we do actually have some suggestions of articles and books, and we will add those so that you can get them.
Okay. Hopefully they can click on a link on this screen and actually get access to those. All right, let's move to the next one. Using the Google Cloud Endpoints authentication method, I can receive a user object in my backend, but I'm confused as to how this relates to Google Plus sign-in. Is this the same as Google Plus sign-in?
Well, they're two parts of a whole. So when you define your endpoint function, you can give it a user argument, and then when the function is called, if it's called with an authenticated user, the user argument is instantiated, it has values. If the user's not logged in, they haven't been authenticated, then the user argument is null. Then in your code, you actually have to write the code to check if user is null or if it has values. So that's on the implementation, the function definition side of it. Now, the actual authentication mechanism is handled on the UI side. So if a user wants to use your app, and you require authentication, they must log in to the app itself. It's not good enough that they have another tab open and that they've already logged into Gmail. That doesn't carry over. They have to log into the app when authentication is needed. And the UI of your app will need to call a function to show the authentication login. In JavaScript, it's authorize, I think. It's actually fairly easy code. So then the user logs in with a Google account, and it just has to be a Google account. It doesn't have to be Google Plus. You have to, we call it a Google Plus sign-in, but actually you're just logging into a Google account. So long as you have a Gmail login, that's good enough. So then the user logs in, and then from then on, any time a function is called that requires a user argument, the authenticated user is passed. So they're not identical, but they're basically, the user argument in the endpoint and the Google sign-in. Think of it as Google account sign-in rather than Google Plus sign-in. They work together to pass the user's information into your app.
Great. That was really useful information to know. Awesome. So the next question is also about authentication. Seems like a big fan here. The built-in authentication mechanism for cloud endpoints is awesome. What about customizing it to a different provider other than Google Plus authentication? Can we build our own OAuth 2 server and still use the same code for endpoints?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you think that the authentication mechanism is awesome. And secondly, I'm also glad that this question didn't come up, a while back, because now I can answer it, give it a much better answer. And yes, you can provide a custom authentication mechanism. This is a fairly new feature, and there are docs out there on the developer website. There's the Java doc for the Authenticate interface. So basically, you implement the Authenticate interface and you configure it, and then you can use your own custom authentication mechanism with endpoints. And I'm glad to be able to say that today.
Great. All right, seems that security is on the mind of our users and the students taking the course, so the next one is also very similar. Is it possible to use an authenticated method from a cloud endpoint using another library other than the one generated by App Engine in Android, such as Volley or Retrofit?
Yes, it is possible. But having said that, it is extremely convenient, of course, to use the native client library, which is generated by the App Engine development process. So the way to go about this and actually go away from the client libraries, either to use a JavaScript library which is available where you can make these calls directly. An alternative approach, which is even more raw, is to go to the API Explorer again, try out your methods in the API Explorer, check the URLs that are being generated, the RESTful interface, replace the authentication headers with your appropriate values in your code, and you can try it out with a tool like curl, for example, so you can see that it actually runs. And then before you implement it into your client logic.
Okay, great, awesome. All right, moving on. Now here's a popular question. Will there be a Building Scalable Apps with App Engine course in Python? And if so, when?
Okay, so yes, we've had a lot of requests for the course in Python, and we do have a lot of Python developers. I mean, the very first time App Engine was released, it was exclusively in Python, and then we added Java. So there's a lot of Python developers out there, and obviously there would be even more if we could get the course into Python. We are planning it, we're working on it, but I'm afraid I can't actually give an exact date of when it'll be available.
Okay, great. At least there's something going on. All right, next question we have. Do you have any advice on data modeling? For instance, all of my data is in a document database. Now, I could just migrate each document as a single entity, but I read somewhere this is not a great idea. Or should I take these 60-odd fields and split them up into multiple entities?
Perhaps, perhaps not. It's a difficult question to ask to answer specifically. One thing to think about when you're doing data modeling with the data store is that all the fields that will be fetched and used collaboratively in the same request make sense to bundle them together. And this is called data locality because it enables your query to extract all of that information up front, and your application code can then look at it rather than going to multiple places. So that's one way of doing it. And then, of course, data normalization, whether you should have a strict normalized data model or a very loose one, denormalized data model, drives that as well. One should also be aware that data store is not the only storage option for Google App Engine. You can also use the Google Cloud SQL database. That's another database. So if you're already having a data model that makes sense in a relational world, it probably makes more sense to use Google Cloud SQL instead of the data store.
Okay, great.
So I had a couple things to add to that. I mean, obviously how you model the data depends on how your app is going to use the data. And if you're going to be doing a lot of querying, you need to think about how to minimize the hits to the data store. And you may want to collapse multiple fields into a single field if possible, especially if you're expecting like huge amounts of traffic, to minimize the usage of the data store and keep your quota down. And another thing I wanted to mention is that the Google Cloud data store, the App Engine data store, has very flexible schema. And in the course, you use Objectify and you build up your data as classes, entity classes, but it follows a strict model where you declare the fields and the setters and getters and whatever. But actually, data store itself doesn't require that. Even entities of the same kind, can have different properties. They don't all have to have the same properties. So if you're going to be dynamically creating properties, you don't know what the properties of your data are going to be in advance, and you can't structure it very nicely, like we do in Objectify, with the regular object-oriented behavior, then you can actually use the native data store API, and you can just get and set properties. There's a function get property, set property, so that Wes could have a different property from Magnus, even though they're both Google employees, whatever. So if you're going to be dynamically adding properties and you don't know what they are ahead of time, you may want to think about using the native Java API rather than Objectify. But if your data is very structured and you know ahead of time what your fields are, Objectify is awesome because it really helps you cut down on the amount of code you need to write.
Okay, great, awesome. All right, our first coding question here. So in conference API.java, it seems that in order to get the conference ID, I need to take the key, go fetch the entity in order to get the ID. Why do I have to do that?
Well, that's not quite what you have to do. If you have the key, then from the key you can get the ID. If you already know the key and what you want is the ID, there's no need to fetch the entity from the data store. And in the create conference function, what we do is we let App Engine allocate an ID for us. So we create the key and we auto allocate the ID. So at this point we have the key and the key has the ID. But before we created the key, we didn't know what the ID was, but after we create the key, we can get the ID from the key. But at this point, we haven't saved the entity in the data store. So actually at that point, if you tried to get the entity out of the data store, you wouldn't because it's not already there. But in general, only go to the data store if you really need to go to the data store. So if you want the ID, you have the key, just go ahead and get the ID straight from the key.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, next question we have is, one of the neat things about Mongo and Couch is its JavaScript interface. For example, you can create and run JavaScript queries really simply in the browser. Is there any chance of having something like this for the data store?
Yes, it actually exists already, a JavaScript interface. So data store is explained within the Google App Engine product section. But if you go up one level and look at the cloud pages, there's actually something called the Google Cloud Data Store. Now this is exactly the same thing as the Google App Engine data store. And there you can see APIs where you can actually use JavaScript and other languages as well. And you can use these different languages to access your Google App Engine data store. So there is JavaScript support there that you can use. Also in the developer console, there is the query engine for the Google App Engine data store. So if you go down and click on the data store viewer, there is actually a user interface where you can fill in the fields and the values. So if you don't need programmatic flexibility, that could also be a very, very convenient way to look at the data that you have stored.
Oh, okay, great. So that's good to know that the Google Cloud Data Store is actually using the same technology as App Engine's native data store.
Yeah,
okay.
They are the same thing.
All right, that's great, awesome. All right, next student question we have is, do you have any advice or information on importing data? My ideal scenario would be just to import some JSON and have the data store automatically created for me. I did a little bit of research on it, but it seems kind of confusing.
It's the same thing there. When you look at the Google App Engine data stores, you don't have any documentation around this. You have to write all of the code. But if you go one step up and you look at the Google Cloud Data Store, there, again, the capability exists there to write Java code. And you can insert JSON objects that are automatically mapped over to the data store. So I would suggest going to the Google Cloud Data Store and check out the JavaScript API if you specifically want to insert JSON objects into the data store. If you want to insert blobs or byte arrays, for example, you can do that already programmatically in the data store just by storing a byte array in an entity object, of course. If you have very, very, very large blobs, byte arrays, there's also another technology called Google Cloud Storage. And Google Cloud Storage allows you to store extremely large byte arrays, also small, but extremely large byte arrays, and then associate them with a key. And you can read and write this data between App Engine and cloud storage.
Wow, those were great student questions, but that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to give a big thanks to our special stars of the course, Magnus and Jocelyn, for taking the time out to chat with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you, Wes.
All right, great. And I'd like to encourage you all to give the course a try. We'd love to see you all developing scalable apps using our cloud. To help you get started, we're giving students in the Developing Scalable Apps course $500 worth of credits against using the Google Cloud Platform. You can access those credits directly from your course dashboard. We also want to give you a 50% off coupon for taking the exam if you choose to become a qualified Google Cloud Platform developer. Click on the on-screen link to get that discount. Well, thanks everyone. This is Wesley Chun, and we'll see you in the cloud.